B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Bastille Day, Tuesday, July 14th, 2020. And here in the United States, a bloodthirsty majority on the Supreme Court worked overnight to reinstate execution at the federal level here in the United States. It's been 17 years since the U.S. executed a federal convict. And at the prison in Terre Haute, a man who I know a little bit, Bill Pelkey, was there to protest the government's resumption of executions. And he posted on Facebook just before I went to sleep last night that he and his colleagues had left the Terre Haute federal prison, having been informed there would be no execution. And that was based on a court order from a Washington, D.C. judge, Tanya Chutkan, that was issued on Monday. But in short order, the Bill Barr Justice Department, which also conducts legal representation of Donald J. Trump, intervened, and in an unsigned 5-4 ruling, but you know how the split came down, they said that the trial court judge was wrong, that the single drug injection of pentobarbital has been used in over 100 executions without incident and had been upheld by the Supreme Court and appeals courts. Now, there is evidence that people who have been executed with pentobarbital suffered quite a bit before they expired. But the court saw that as simply inconvenient. And so at 8:07 Eastern Time this morning, Daniel Lee was strapped to a gurney. Well, actually, he spent 4 hours strapped to that as the legal machinations proceeded. And his final statement was a declaration of his innocence. "I didn't do it," Lee said. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, but I am not a murderer." He claimed the judge in his Arkansas trial overlooked DNA evidence that proved his alibi. He was across the country at the time of the murders. But it may seem odd to you that in cases like this, the Supreme Court does not review a claim of innocence. That's at this stage considered a technicality that the court doesn't have to review. So we do know that Justices Breyer, Ginsburg, Sotomayor, and Kagan issued dissents. And that's how we can calculate that it is the 5 Republican-appointed justices, who are all believed to be pro-life when it comes to an unborn child, but pro-death when it comes to state-sponsored murder. So Breyer and Ginsburg wrote, "The resumption of federal executions promises to provide examples that illustrate the difficulties of administering the death penalty consistent with the Constitution." Sotomayor, joined by Ginsburg and Kagan, quote, "Today's decision illustrates just how grave the consequences of such accelerated decision-making can be. The court forever deprives respondents of their ability to press a constitutional challenge to their lethal injections and prevents lower courts from reviewing that challenge." The government is planning to snuff out the lives of 2 other federal prisoners this week, Wesley Perkey, age 68, and Dustin Honkin, aged 52. And on the pro-life front, or is it pro-birth, a federal judge has permanently blocked the state of Georgia's hardline 6-week abortion ban. This is one of those pretextual laws that was passed knowing that it would not pass Supreme Court muster, and the recent court decision where Chief Justice Roberts joined the Democratic appointees to block the pretextual trap law from Louisiana, the Georgia legislature knew that this bill would never pass court muster. But they do this hoping that one of these obviously unconstitutional laws will wind up at the Supreme Court and could become the basis to overturn Roe v. Wade. And so election theft expert and current Republican Governor Brian Kemp said, "We will appeal the court's decision. Georgia values life. We will keep fighting for the rights of the unborn." And the law in question started off as a so-called heartbeat bill, meaning that the ban on abortion begins when a heartbeat can be detected. But according to this account from The Guardian, it is a medical misnomer because the law takes effect, or the term of the law takes effect, earlier than a full beating heart has formed in a human fetus. So the standard reverts to 20 weeks of gestation for a legal abortion in the state of Georgia right now. In other court action, the Trump administration cannot withhold funding from the state of California or cities like San Francisco for their sanctuary laws that restrict police cooperation with federal immigration. This is a 3-0 decision from a panel of the uber-liberal Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals based here, including one judge appointed by Donald Trump. The judges wrote, "No evidence has been cited to suggest that local officials have ignored ICE requests for immigration status information." He said the federal information sharing requirement does not extend to contact and release status information, and that the government may not withhold funding from California because of the way it decides to participate or not participate in the enforcement of federal immigration laws. So I consider that to be a win. Let's see if that one rises to the Supreme Court and what the justices will do with it. And while we're at the courthouses, Ghislaine Maxwell appeared by video at a federal court in Manhattan today, where she pleaded not guilty to the charges, and there are quite a few that have been pressed against her, and she continues to fight for bail. She was arrested on July 2nd at an estate that she bought last year in Bradford, New Hampshire. She's charged in a 17-page indictment with conspiracy to entice minors to travel to engage in illegal sex acts, enticement of a minor to travel to engage in illegal sex acts, conspiracy to transport minors with intent to engage in criminal sexual activity, transportation of a minor, and perjury. All, of course, related to her personal and pimp relationship with the late Jeffrey Epstein. And there is the prospect that in one of these hearings, she will be required to face one of her accusers. So this is going to be an ongoing case. It's going to take a long time. I don't expect a trial to occur for at least a year. But the wheels of justice, however slowly, are moving in that case. John Aletto files this report from Seattle today. Our correspondent says that an off-duty policewoman who drove through a protest on the 4th of July is no longer employed by the Seattle Police Department. 2 days before that, a group of protesters reported the same blue sedan was spotted as the officer yelled hate speech at protesters while circling them. Police reported that the officer had attempted to drive through an opening in the crowd, but protesters surrounded the vehicle, and they have not said if the policewoman quit or was fired. And in a series of claims, and the way this works with a municipality, if you've suffered damages, say an injury from a police officer, You cannot sue. You first must file a claim, and then if the claim is denied or rejected, then you can file a lawsuit. So 12 parties have filed notice of claims against the city of Seattle, the county, and the state of Washington related to excessive force during the Seattle protests. Among the claims, Armand Avery has filed claims on behalf of his son and himself. Both were sprayed with mace at a May 30th protest, and the video of the sprayed child went viral. Some people say that was one of the triggers for the formation of the protest zone on Capitol Hill. They started off calling it Chaz, and then they shifted the name to CHOP. The family of Summer Taylor, who was killed on I-5 by a man in a white Jaguar, has also filed claims against the county, specifically against Sheriff's Deputy Mike Brown, who shared an image of a car sticker portraying people getting run over with the caption, "All Lives Splatter." Other officials who liked or shared similar images are also being investigated. Daniel Gregory, who was shot in the arm June 7th trying to neutralize another car attack, also filed a claim. Black Lives Matter activists estimate there have been at least 68 vehicular assaults on BLM protesters nationwide, and at least 18 of them so far confirmed as intentional attacks. Nikita Tarver filed a claim after she was hit in the eye by a projectile, and I have more on eye injuries here coming up next from the Washington Post. Malachi Howell filed a claim after being hit in the hand with a tear gas canister, partially amputating thumb and forefinger. Jenna Kenyon, hit in the stomach with a rubber bullet, later dragged into police lines and knocked unconscious. John William Kelleher alleges being jumped on, a cop had his arm around his neck, and he was arrested after he accidentally brushed up against an officer. Jordan Pickett filed a claim after saying he was hit with a baton round while gathering information for University of Washington's newspaper. Daniel Pierce and Joey Weiser filed claims in regard to the use of chemical weapons and force. Gillian Williams claims suffering bone contusions as well as nerve and muscle damage from a police projectile during the June 7th protests. Police Chief Carmen Best and Mayor Jenny Durkin have claimed that a 50% budget cut would cause the department to be unable to function. As a comment from Jonah, this claim appears to be the result of calculating the 50% cut to the entire year's budget when the year is already more than half over. Reform advocates have clarified that it's a 50% cut going forward, which would mean about a 25% cut for the balance of 2020. Police have been calling the 50% cuts catastrophic, claiming that it means over half of officers would have to be laid off, primarily younger Black and Indigenous people of color. Reform activists say they are unsurprised by the police making this threat and insist they have thought the issues through and will propose a realistic budget before long that shifts responsibilities away from the police. And across the bay from me in Oakland, the police department, or at least members, and its union are trying to offer an argument that is, pretty specious. So recently there have been 7 killings in Oakland, and the cops are resisting cuts to their budget, saying that this could lead to more gun violence. But this police department in Oakland has been unable to stem gun violence in this city for decades. And the idea that it is some sort of a blue wall between bullets and their victims is really pretty far-fetched. Now to the issue of the police violence and the use of so-called less lethal rounds that have left large numbers of people injured. The Washington Post has put up a video article, and they say that 8 people lost their vision in one eye after being struck by police projectiles, including lead pellets and other pouches that were fired from shotguns. And they were among 12 people who were partially blinded by police during a week of national unrest. So this is a tally of these eye injuries from various protests that occurred on May 30th. And using cell phone surveillance videos and other records, they were able to show that 6 of these were protesters, 1 was a photojournalist, and 1 was an innocent bystander. And speaking of people struck by police projectiles, I got an email request for a $100 grant from the Peter B. Collins Community Fund. And it comes from Tim. He says, I'm writing on behalf of my 21-year-old transgender son. I've been an appreciative listener for several years. A couple of weeks ago, my son was attending a peaceful, nonviolent demonstration. While standing among the other protesters, he was suddenly shot point blank in the stomach with a rubber bullet by a policeman. There was no warning, and the impact left a large bruise on him. My son is white, and he said to me, Dad, if there had been a black guy standing there, he may have been shot in the head. Clearly, the right to assemble and speak freely was severely violated. My son has been unemployed for about 3 months due to the coronavirus. There's no prospect for employment on the horizon. Your grant would have both a material benefit and a moral boost. Well, Tim, I'm happy to pass along $100, funded in part by our listeners here at the Peter B. Collins podcast, and I'm just glad that your son was not more seriously injured in that encounter with the police. As unemployment numbers remain high and the growth in coronavirus cases continues to climb here in this country, the White House is now signaling their openness to approve a narrow extension of the enhanced unemployment benefits that are currently helping tens of millions, some 30 million, Americans who are jobless as a result of the pandemic. Now, the Republicans are determined to apply some tough love here because they think that you have been just lying on the couch, stuffing your face with ice cream and bonbons because you're getting that rich $600 a week bonus from the federal government. And this, of course, is after they've shoveled billions, if not trillions, at banks and Wall Street. But it appears they're going to try to narrow the group of people who are eligible, limit you or cap you to an unemployment check that is no greater than your average paycheck. And they even tried to come up with a way to give you a bonus if you go back to work. But that is a very complicated, cumbersome process to identify who qualifies for such a payment. They're also talking about another round of $1,200 stimulus payments. And, it's better than nothing, but it's pretty insulting because the idea that Americans who don't qualify for unemployment can get by on 2 $1,200 handouts in this calendar year is just insulting and ridiculous. So there is a real rush to do this. The Senate comes back into session next week on July 20th, 5 days before the benefit will expire in 49 states. So it's possible, but there's going to have to be some quick negotiation related to the so-called HEROES Act that came out of the House, which is the vehicle for the bailouts for state and local government, which I think are certainly needed and justified in the current climate. Over at The Intercept, Bryce Covert reports that the number, it's really a gift to America's banks, for processing applications in the Paycheck Protection Program and putting zero of their own funds at risk. Banks are ready to shovel in as much as $18 billion in processing fees for implementing the loan programs, the PPP, and small business loan programs. And this just shows you the priorities of the people who wrote the CARES Act, which is Mitch McConnell and the Republicans. And you can expect that if there's another round of bailout money, the banks will be filtering that through their sticky fingers. Now, there are warning signs that could lead to another housing crisis like we saw in the crash of 2008. In April, 3.4% of Americans were at least 30 days delinquent on their mortgage. And that was one of the first signs of the housing crisis back in 2008. Now, one of the anomalies here is that by April, many banks and mortgage lenders had offered forbearance to their borrowers, saying, look, we know things are uncertain, and basically you don't have to pay your mortgage this month. We will just tack it on to the end of your loan period. But the other issue here, of course, is renters. And there's an estimated 28 million people who are overdue on their rent, subject to eviction, starting in a kind of rolling process that will kick in. In some places it already has, and by August 1st, we're going to see it in widespread use. And where are those people going to go? Nobody has a clue. And nobody's even talking about it, really. So over the troubled Postal Service, and if you recall yesterday's podcast, I had a list of these unaddressed systemic failures of our government. And my ire is aimed at both parties. And the U.S. Postal Service since 2005 has been saddled with a ridiculous fiscal requirement that causes them to run a deficit every year. Because unlike any other government or corporate entity, the Postal Service is required to pay ahead of time the pension and retiree health benefits of its fairly large workforce. So now riding to the rescue is a Trump donor, the new Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy. And he brought his wrecking crew with him to the agency. I think he just started yesterday. And one of the things that he's changing is the culture of the post office. He's saying, well, look, you don't have to make repeated trips to the distribution center that's in each region. You just deliver the mail that you have at the time when the truck is supposed to go out. And by reducing timely delivery as an ethic of the Postal Service, it's just one further step toward dismantling it. And of course, corporate people like Trump believe that FedEx and UPS, and to some extent, while he wouldn't want to give business to Jeff Bezos and Amazon, we now have many different delivery services, but they're focused on the big cities. They don't want the responsibility for what is called the last mile, delivering to suburban, rural, and farms way the heck out there at the end of the road, like Tom Bodett would say. And so this is just the first step. Trump has demanded that he won't bail out the post office unless they quadruple package delivery rates. He thinks Jeff Bezos is getting a big break. And the Postal Service has declared that they want to keep rates competitive. They want to be cheaper than FedEx and UPS so that they are attractive to customers. But if I work for the Postal Service, I'm sure that there will be a Postal Service and there will be postal workers, but they're going to be fewer. And I, for one, am willing to sacrifice Saturday delivery. It's not that important to me anymore. It used to be. But there's so little that's important that comes by the post that I'm willing to see reductions in service to salvage the whole operation and preserve delivery to those difficult end-of-the-road locations. Well, as I reported to you at my deadline yesterday, California Governor Newsom has taken us several steps back, and we are essentially in a modified lockdown compared to where we were 3 months ago. He's halted the reopening process. He has put a stop to indoor restaurants, bars, movie theaters, many of the businesses that have just started to resume their operations. He tightened business restrictions in 29 counties that account for about 80% of the state's populations. Those counties have to close gyms, houses of worship, hair and nail salons. I think massage parlors too, but I didn't check on that specifically. Here's today's COVID-19 update, prepared by Linda Lewis. Worldwide, we have 13 million cases, 574,000 deaths. In the United States, 3.3 million cases, 136,000 deaths. Florida has set a one-day death record at 132, and the caseload continues to rise at a very high rate. The rolling 7-day average is 81 deaths per day in Florida, currently the second highest in the country behind Texas, and double the average of 39 2 weeks ago. A Forbes article points out that 32% of young adults are vulnerable to severe COVID-19 infection. This covers the 18 to 25 age cell. It's based on a study of responses to a national health interview survey completed by more than 8,000 young adults that ask questions useful for determining if the respondents have any risk factors identified by the CDC, like diabetes, asthma, immune condition. The survey also included questions about the use of tobacco, another risk factor. Sorting out the responses to the relevant questions revealed that 32% of this sample of 18 to 25-year-olds qualified as yes, 33% of males, 30% of females. Of all the criteria, smoking in the past 30 days was the most common issue that folks had, with 11% of them responding affirmative to that question, followed by asthma, 9%, vaping, 7%, cigars, 5%. So that, in some ways, explains the demographic shift where older people were most vulnerable in the first, say, 3 months of the pandemic, and it has shifted significantly younger just in recent weeks, really since summer arrived and people started resuming some of their usual activities. A research letter published in the Journal of the American Medical Association reported on the experiences of patients in Italy who had been discharged from the hospital after recovery from COVID-19, and it found that 87% of patients reported at least one persistent symptom, the most common being fatigue and dyspnea. And I don't know what dyspnea is, but I said it. Dyspnear. And Linda notes limitations of the study include lack of information on symptom history before the COVID-19 illness, lack of details on the severity of symptoms. Further, this is a single-center study with a relatively small number of patients, but I think it is an interesting snapshot. Now, the big controversy going on today across the United States is whether to open schools or not. And by the way, just before I started recording, I saw the news that the Trump administration has backed off on denying visas to non-American students who aren't able to attend classes on campus because they're not being held. They're being done on video. And Linda, drawing from the Daily Beast, notes that of 1,400 Israelis diagnosed with COVID-19 in the past month, 47% were infected in schools. Now there are 2,000 students, teachers, and staff who test positive. 28,000 are quarantined. The resurgence followed an abrupt May 17 decision to reopen all schools. On that date, following 2 months of total lockdown, it appeared the virus had been controlled, defeated, with only 10 new cases in Israel that day. In the first 2 weeks of July, 393 kindergartens and schools open for summer programs have been shuttered due to cases of COVID-19. On July 2nd, Eric Fiegel-Ding, an epidemiologist and health economist at the Federation of American Scientists, tweeted a chart showing Israel's rate of infection surging past Europe and fast approaching the rate in the United States, noting that it was exactly 1 month since the reopening of Israeli schools. And as of today, Israel reported 1,681 new cases, its worst result since the outbreak began. The source of the infection explosion can be seen clearly in the numbers from June. In a report to the Knesset, 1,400 Israelis were diagnosed with the disease in June, 185 caught it at events like weddings, 128 in hospitals, 113 in workplaces, 108 in restaurants, bars, or clubs, and 116 in synagogues, while 657, or 47%, were infected in schools. So get this. Every morning I take a look at the Los Angeles Times on my iPad, and the big headline on the front page today is that the school district in Los Angeles County, LA Unified, has announced that campuses will not reopen for classes on August 18th. The nation's second-largest school system will continue with online learning until further notice because of the worsening coronavirus surge. Austin Butner, who is the superintendent, said this has been a difficult decision, but the district cannot come close to protecting the health and safety of 500,000 K-12 students and about 75,000 employees. But in the same LA Times, in the B section, is the story how in Orange County, which is pretty much sandwiched between LA County and San Diego County, the Board of Education voted 4-1 to approve recommendations for reopening schools in the fall that do not include the mandatory use of masks for students or increased social distancing in classrooms. And they described this in the context of courage. Among our greatest responsibilities as adults is our responsibility to model courage and persistence in the face of uncertainty and fear. Well, I would suggest they're modeling recklessness and a willingness to take a chance on the health of students, faculty, and the families that both students and faculty go home to. And while it is fair to say that younger people, really young people, are less at risk for enduring the disease, many of them are viewed as likely vectors, carriers of the infection. And so you've got L.A. and San Diego announcing that their campuses won't reopen next month, and Orange County, a hotbed of Republicans, yes, behind that orange curtain, they're taking a distinctly different view. Now, I want to be just honest with you that Orange County has not had the high rate of outbreak that Los Angeles County has. And the OC Board of Education said that local districts can make their own decisions, including closing classrooms. But we see that the politics of Trump are trickling down to the local level. And I don't know if we're going to have the same experience as Israel did, but I really appreciate that Linda found that report, because to me, it is a major eye-opener. And we've got the director of the CDC, Robert Redfield. Trump's still talking to him, which is a bad sign because Fauci, of course, is in the doghouse with the White House. But Redfield is towing the Trump line. He said most counties in the United States are in a position to reopen their schools based on the latest data, and he's urging campuses to bring students back, if possible, as a matter of public health. As an individual with 11 grandchildren, I believe the greater risk is actually to the nation to keep these schools closed. Yeah, the cure is worse than the... So this is confounding. There is little doubt about that. But I hate to see our classrooms become laboratories where we just do a little trial and error, see what happens. I'm not here to predict that bad things will happen. But I fear that that could be the case. The scarcity of union representation among American workers means that most depend on government agencies to enforce workplace safety and health laws. But as the pandemic rages, most are largely on their own. According to a new report from Vox, the federal OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, has received more than 6,000 complaints about coronavirus-related safety, but only one citation, 1 out of 6,000, has resulted, and that was a $6,500 fine against a Georgia nursing home for failing to report within 24 hours that 6 of their employees had been hospitalized. Nancy Lassen, labor attorney from Philly, quote, "I am horrified at OSHA. I can't even call it a response. They delegated their enforcement authority and their substantive authority to state and local entities, which leaves the typical non-organized, non-union worker who has no lion protecting them at the mercy of whatever their employer decides to do." And OSHA's coronavirus guidelines started issuing them on March 9th, called for employers to develop their own infectious disease preparedness and response plans. Oh, yeah. Self-regulation worked really well on Wall Street. And after she filed her daily report, Linda sent this along. It's an article from the Texas Tribune. A stunning headline. Texas hospitals are running out of drugs, beds, ventilators, and even staff. Many hospitals are no longer accepting transfer patients because they want to maintain space for their own communities. And the article opens with these bullets. A coronavirus patient in Anahuac was flown by helicopter to a hospital in El Campo, 120 miles away, because closer facilities couldn't take him. Ambulances are waiting up to 10 hours to deliver patients to packed Hidalgo County emergency rooms. Short-staffed hospitals in Midland and Odessa have had to turn away ailing COVID-19 patients from rural West Texas facilities that can't offer the care that they need. And here's a quote from the president of the Texas College of Emergency Physicians, Robert Hancock. "It used to be if one hospital got kind of overwhelmed, you'd start transferring out ICU patients to other facilities that had beds available. And there really is none of that now because everybody's in the same boat. They're struggling to get their own patients admitted." Now, Governor Greg Abbott has expanded his ban on elective procedures to try to create more space in the hospitals. But he turned a blind eye to these problems because he was feeling the Trump. And this article includes a map that shows Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, and Houston, along with the border counties, are the hardest hit with the near capacity hospital facilities. And across the country yesterday, we again exceeded 50,000 new infections. The number was 57,000. Also, this is from the Washington Post. Health systems in Texas and Arizona are requesting mobile morgues, refrigerated trailers, to store what they see as a rising death toll predicted by the wave of infections and hospitalizations. In other news, our pal Pepe Escobar sent me his latest dispatch published in Asia Times, where he takes a look at this newly announced deal between Iran and China for trade and military partnerships. And he says this is no secret whatsoever since at least last year. It revolves around a $400 billion Chinese investment in Iran's energy and infrastructure for the next 25 years. It's all about securing a matter of supreme Chinese national interest, a steady supply of oil and gas bypassing the dangerous bottleneck of the Strait of Malacca, secured with a median 18% discount and not paid in the U.S. dollar, paid in yuan, the Chinese currency, or in a basket of other non-American currencies. And that really rankles the U.S. And its bankers. Beijing will also invest about $228 billion, that's in dollars, in Iranian infrastructure, but especially up through 2025. It ranges from building factories to badly needed energy facilities. There's also a high-speed rail project underway that will be in part funded by China. And Pepe writes, the terms of aerial and naval military cooperation between Iran and China and also Russia are still not finalized, as Iranian sources told me, that's Pepe, and no one has had access to the details. Geopolitically and geoeconomically, the key takeaway is that the U.S. relentless blockade of the Iranian economy, featuring hardcore weaponized sanctions, is impotent to do anything about the wide-ranging Iran-China deal. The Iran-China strategic partnership is yet another graphic demonstration of what could be deconstructed as the Chinese brand of exceptionalism, a collective mentality and enough organized planning capable of establishing a wide-ranging win-win economic, political, and military partnership. Trump went to Miami last weekend. One of the events that he presided over allowed him to pander to the supporters of regime change in Venezuela. And he teased them during a meeting with the leaders of the U.S. military Southern Command. He said, something will happen with Venezuela. That's all I can tell you, before adding that Washington would be very much involved. So this is one of Trump's biggest problems. He cannot keep things under wraps. But it does tell us that there are plans, probably designed for election year consumption here in the United States, to try to take down Nicolas Maduro, who is the legitimate leader. Trump continues to publicly back his opponent Juan Guaido, telling the expats in Miami that he still stands with the righteous leader of Venezuela. I guess he means Guaido. A recent poll found that only 3% of Venezuelans recognize Guaido as legitimate. 80% of the country says the entire opposition movement has no credibility whatsoever. But that won't stop the bipartisan supporters of regime change in Washington, D.C. And the fact is that Joe Biden offers very little difference from Donald Trump about the future of Venezuela. You remember Bill Richardson? He was Clinton's UN ambassador. He went on to become governor of New Mexico. Well, he's done a lot of international diplomacy. He's gone to North Korea. He brought home the ailing Otto Warmbier, who died a few days later. And he's done this for many years. So the family of two of the American mercenaries who attempted to invade Venezuela on May 4th, where they hoped to capture Nicolas Maduro and deliver him for a $15 million bounty payment, which, by the way, wasn't coming from Russia. Well, they reached out to the former governor at the Richardson Center in, I think, Santa Fe. And I believe at this hour, Bill Richardson is on his way to Caracas with the knowledge, not necessarily the approval, of the U.S. State Department. And I have mixed feelings because I consider these guys mercenaries who deserve their fate. But as a humanist, I support Governor Richardson's effort to win their release. And I'll tell you a quick story. I've met Bill Richardson on several occasions, and he invited me to look him up if I was ever in Santa Fe. So as it happened, this is around 2005, we had a family reunion outside Santa Fe. So I called the governor's office and I said, hey, it's Peter B. Collins, and Mr. Richardson invited me to stop by. Can I bring my family? They said yes. And at dinner that night, I said, hey, tomorrow I'm going in to see the governor. Anybody want to go? And 11 of my brothers, sisters, nieces, and nephews said, yeah, I want to go. I said, great. So we all showed up, and the staff was a little overwhelmed. But when we were ushered into his spacious office, the governor couldn't have been more welcoming. And about every 5 minutes, a staffer would pop in and said, can I get rid of him yet? And he'd say, no, I'm still talking to him. And at one point, he took a call from the governor of a state across the border in Mexico. And he put it on the speakerphone for us. The discussion was about getting cement across the border. And Richardson showed us his skills in diplomacy. He spoke fluent Spanish. Left quite an impression on my young nieces and nephews. Well, the New York Times won't have Barry Weiss to kick around anymore. She was a member of the editorial staff, wrote opinion columns, and I found her quite annoying. She is fawned over by Bill Maher, who's had her on his TV show many times. And I take exception to her extreme Zionism. And beyond that, she poses as a liberal, and she's not very liberal. But in a lengthy note about her departure written yesterday, Weiss criticized the Times for caving to the whims of critics on Twitter and for not standing up for her after she said she was bullied by other Times staff members. Quote, the paper of record is more and more the record of those living in a distant galaxy, one whose concerns are profoundly removed from the lives of most people. Nowadays, standing up for principle at the paper does not win plaudits. It puts a target on your back. Part of this relates to the recent decision to publish that, what would we call it, incendiary column by Senator Tom Cotton. We later learned that the editors of the editorial section reached out to Senator Cotton and said, hey, we'd like you to write an incendiary column. And when he did, everybody was shocked by it. And Weiss also blames the Twitter machine. Quote, Twitter is not on the masthead of the New York Times, but Twitter has become its ultimate editor. As ethics and mores of that platform have become those of the paper itself has increasingly become a kind of performance space. Stories are chosen and told in a way to satisfy the narrowest of audiences, rather than to allow a curious public to read about the world and then draw their own conclusions. And I have my own issues with Twitter, but I don't have enough information to know whether her claim is accurate or not. And in an unrelated move, simply the timing is similar, Andrew Sullivan, the gay conservative, announced he is leaving New York Magazine by the end of the week. He said the underlying reasons for the split are pretty self-evident. And that seems pretty cryptic to me because I don't know what the hell he's talking about. Jerry Frazia, our friend at Lake Como, he writes, Peter, before liberals are reinforced in their thinking that the Trump commutation of Roger Stone is uniquely corrupt for a sitting president, it would be useful to recall George H.W. Bush's pardon in 1992 of Caspar Weinberger and 5 others just before he left office, which was done with a massive Trump-like conflict of interest, resulting in getting George Poppy Bush off the hook. Well, that's a fair comment. And Bill Clinton refused to pursue any charges against the Iran-Contra people who were not pardoned, and that one was left to linger. Now, speaking of Roger Stone, Andrew Weissman, one of the top lieutenants to Bob Mueller in the limited hangout investigation, he doesn't seem quite finished with Roger Stone. He's written a book called Where Law Ends Inside the Mueller Investigation, coming out at the end of September. But he'd like to put Roger Stone in front of a grand jury to get at the truth of why he lied. Mr. Stone can be served with a grand jury subpoena by a federal or state prosecutor, or even a congressional subpoena, requiring him to answer the question, why did you lie to Congress? Weissman outlined 3 choices that Stone would have, which would be to lie again, opening himself up to new prosecution, to refuse to comply, which could result in contempt charges and jail time, or to tell the truth. Roger Stone doesn't know how to tell the truth. That's an unfair set of options. Joe Biden, to his credit, is amping up his position on climate change. It's not a Green New Deal. But he's talking about a plan to spend $2 trillion over only 4 years, so that's a significant amount of money, to escalate the use of clean energy in transportation, electricity, and building sectors. He wants to focus on the nation's infrastructure, cut fossil fuel emissions, and this is a step up. His original plan was only $1.7 trillion over 10 years. And he's moved up the date for net zero emissions from 2050 to 2035. Yeah, it's just politics, but he's moving toward the progressive Bernie Sanders voter, and I want to acknowledge that that is a big difference from the stiff arm that Hillary Clinton gave voters of the Bernie persuasion back in 2016. And last night on Trevor Noah's Daily Show, he featured the former Secretary of State, who was lounging in opulence at one of her homes, I think in Westchester. And, you know, it was Hillary. They didn't talk about anything that mattered, so. There's an interesting piece by Amber Phillips in today's Washington Post, a kind of step-by-step roadmap for how Democrats could win back the Senate this year. And crucially, the Alabama primary, which is being held under COVID conditions today, will determine who faces Doug Jones, who is probably the most vulnerable so-called Democrat in the Senate today. Jeff Sessions has an uphill fight against former Auburn University football coach Tommy Tuberville. Then Gary Peters in Michigan is a potentially vulnerable Democrat. Phillips writes that the Democrats have to dispatch Cory Gardner of Colorado, but John Hickenlooper isn't much of a candidate. Martha McSally in Arizona is quite vulnerable, and that's where Mark Kelly, the former astronaut and husband of Gabby Giffords, may be able to pull off a win for the Democrats. Tom Tillis in North Carolina is facing former state senator and war veteran Cal Cunningham. Susan Collins in Maine is vulnerable. And I believe today is the primary there that will determine if Maine House Speaker Sarah Gideon will be her opponent. Joni Ernst in Iowa is one of the targeted Republicans. Steve Daines in Montana. Looks like Steve Bullock, the sitting governor, who ran a kind of breezy campaign for president for a while, may be able to pull that off. And then there's the appointed interim senator in Georgia, Kelly Loeffler. She's being challenged by Doug Collins, a fellow Republican. And I don't know who the Democratic opponent is likely to be in the Georgia Senate race, which is a special election. It's not on the routine cycle. Shahid Buttar is a man I've known for many years. He was the founding director of the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, a guest on this podcast many times. He moved to San Francisco to join the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and he is in his second turn, running against Nancy Pelosi. And he's a great progressive. I get all of his campaign materials, and I nod my head, Shahid, that's right. He is an out democratic socialist. But because of Pelosi's power, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who knocked off one of Pelosi's lieutenants in New York 2 years ago, she's not willing to endorse Shahid. Neither is Bernie Sanders so far. And while he's run an aggressive campaign, and as I mentioned, this is his second attempt, he only picked up 13% in the primary, which enables him in our top two system into a face-to-face with Pelosi in November. And Shahid is currently trying to get Pelosi to do what she has refused to do ever since she was elected in 1987, and that is debate her opponent. And I worked on a Pelosi campaign. I've told you about this in 1996. And she does not believe that she has to debate. Now, I'm not a consultant to the Buttar campaign. But the best thing he could do would be to pay for a poll and get that poll to show that he's up to at least 30% from the 13 that he garnered in the primary. That would strike a little fear in the Pelosi camp and might get her to agree to debate. I consider it unlikely. And I think that the other thing that might be on Shahid's agenda is that Pelosi has indicated that she will step down as Speaker after this next term, which would mean she would likely retire from the House and open up that seat. So if Shahid's strategy is to prepare for that eventuality, well, he could wind up with that seat later, but not so much sooner. And one of his big fans, John Zwiebel in Hawaii, a big supporter of this program, fills my inbox every day with information, well, not every day, but often, about Shahid. He did an interview with Jeremy Scahill at The Intercept, and he made some good points. He said, the coup undermining the legitimacy of our elections happened a long time ago. You don't need a computer to hack an election. You don't need a Russian state intelligence agency to hack an election. You can do it when a right-wing Supreme Court invites right-wing state legislatures around the country to start attacking voting rights. And he went on to properly criticize the Pelosi-driven impeachment of Donald Trump. Pelosi affirmatively took off the table all of the strongest charges against the president. The impeachment absolutely did not address his human rights abuses, incitements to violence, his lies to the public and policymakers, or his documented unprecedented corruption and theft from the American people, his self-enrichment at public expense. And the latest missive from Mr. Zwiebel references my friend Yasha Levine's criticism of Shahid Buttar. And he basically nails Shahid because he went to work for the Electronic Freedom Foundation. And I have my own issues with EFF. And what Yasha has exposed in his book and in articles is that they run the Tor program. They get funding from the State Department. Tor is not the safe, encrypted system that you might think it is. And so I chose not to cover Yasha Levine's attack on Shahid Buttar because I don't have any information that Shahid had anything to do with the State Department funding or Tor while he worked at EFF. And finally, today I want to say farewell to one of the great environmentalists of California and Marin County, where I'm based. Huey Johnson has passed away at the age of 87. And he was a longtime fighter for the environment. He converted private property into public lands, into open space, lands that were owned by trust funds. A real visionary. He also became a part of the Jerry Brown administration during Brown's first 2 terms as governor. And I am posting a link to my video interview that I did 2 years ago with Huey Johnson, where he told me that Governor Moonbeam had not bothered to call him on his 80th birthday. That was in response to, you still in touch with Jerry? Huey Johnson, happy trails. Thanks for listening to this news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.